She was invisible, a maid no one noticed, cleaning floors in silence. But one day, in a room full of billionaires and powerful men, she did the unthinkable. And that single choice didn't just save a $300 million deal. It changed her life forever. She was once just a maid, and now her name stands on a global empire. If you believe in stories that give hope to the unheard, like this video, share it and subscribe. Together, we'll keep opening doors for voices the world has overlooked. Let me take you to a morning in Miami. A morning that started like any other, but would end by changing everything. The sun was just beginning to rise over the shimmering waters of Miami Beach. Golden light spilled through the tall glass windows of a mansion built to impress. The floors, polished Italian marble, reflected every ray of sunlight like fire on stone. The breeze was warm, heavy with summer heat, and even inside that mansion, it carried a restless edge. It was 8:58 a.m. Inside the Grand Hall, Victor Reynolds, one of the most powerful men in the American tech world, was pacing. His suit was flawless, his gold watch glinted, but his fingers tapped nervously against his palm. He was a billionaire, the kind of man who was used to controlling every room he entered. But today, control was slipping through his hands. In the conference room, 3 Middle Eastern investors sat waiting. Silent, composed. Their dark eyes watched everything without giving away a single thought. They were powerful men, men who valued tradition and respect. They were ready to sign a deal worth $300 million, a partnership that could expand Victor's empire into an entirely new region. But they had made one demand, a fluent Arabic translator, and that translator was nowhere to be found. Victor's assistant, young and trembling, stammered out the excuse. "He got sick on the way here, sir. He won't make it." Victor's face hardened. "Sick? This isn't a school project. This is the future of the company. I need him here now." But no matter how many calls he made, no matter how many agencies he barked at, the answer was the same. No translator could reach the mansion in time. The investors began to murmur among themselves in low Arabic. Their glances grew sharper, their patience thinner. For them, a translator wasn't a luxury. It was a sign of respect, a non-negotiable. And without it, the deal would collapse before it even began. Victor slammed a chair back into place. His reputation as a ruthless negotiator meant nothing now. Without the right words, all his power was useless. And yet, in the corner of that pristine hall, someone else was listening. Mara Omar, the maid, invisible in her gray uniform, scrubbing at the crystal staircase with hands that still smelled of cleaning solution. She had been in that house for over a year. People passed her by as if she were furniture. She was never greeted, never truly seen. But in that moment, she heard everything. Every curse, every threat, every ounce of desperation in Victor's voice. Mara took a slow breath. Deep inside her, a memory stirred. The voice of her father, a professor of linguistics back in Sudan. She remembered evenings spent surrounded by books and papers, listening as he spoke in Arabic, English, French, and beyond. She remembered her grandmother's stories told in the desert wind, words that carried courage through generations. Mara was not just a maid. She had once studied languages herself, until life and survival had forced her to abandon her dreams. She had been silent for so long, silent to survive. But now, as the most powerful man in the house panicked before her eyes, she knew she could save him. Still, she hesitated, because stepping forward meant burning the veil of invisibility that had kept her safe. The investors shifted, their impatience clear. One of them muttered sharply in Arabic. Victor, unable to understand, snapped at his staff. "This is falling apart." And then, the silence was broken by a voice no one expected. "Sir," Mara said softly, her cloth still in her hand. "If you'd like, I could try to translate." The entire room froze. Victor turned, staring at her as if he had seen a ghost. "You," he asked. "You're the maid." Mara's voice didn't waver. "Yes, but I'm also fluent in classical Arabic and Gulf dialects. My father taught linguistics. I can help you." For a moment, nobody spoke. The assistants exchanged confused glances. One even stifled a laugh. But then, one of the investors leaned forward and spoke a phrase directly to her in Arabic. Mara answered immediately. Smooth, precise, respectful. The man's expression softened into a smile. His colleagues nodded. Victor blinked, caught between disbelief and pride. He could feel his empire slipping, and now, in front of him, the solution had come from the person he had overlooked the most. Finally, he nodded once. Fine. Sit down. Make it count. And so, Mara Omar walked to the table. The maid's gray uniform still clung to her shoulders. A damp cleaning cloth was still in her hand. But as she took her seat beside the investors, something changed. For the first time, the people in that room realized she wasn't there just to clean. The first words she spoke were silk. She translated with confidence, her voice steady like calm water in the middle of a storm. Not once did she stumble. Not once did she hesitate. And with each sentence, the walls that had kept her invisible for so long began to crack. That morning in Miami began with panic, arrogance, and silence. But it ended with a maid's voice filling the room. A voice that would change the course of her life and the future of everyone sitting at that table. And that, my friends, was only the beginning. When Mara sat at that table, cloth still in her hand, the air in the room shifted. For months, no, for years, she had been invisible. But the moment she spoke, the silence cracked like glass. The first investor, a man with a trimmed beard and steady eyes, leaned forward. He spoke in Arabic, his tone sharp, testing. Mara answered without flinching. Her words were flawless, respectful, precise. The man's expression softened into surprise, then into something rare in business, respect. The other investors exchanged glances, then smiled. And just like that, the meeting that was seconds away from disaster found its rhythm again. Victor Reynolds watched in stunned silence. For so long, he had believed that control came from wealth, from power, from the fear he struck in others. But here, in this room, control had shifted into the hands of the woman he had never once bothered to notice. Every time an investor spoke, Mara's voice carried their words across the table like a bridge, smooth and unbroken. Every time Victor responded, she shaped his tone with a care he had never known how to use himself. She softened hard edges. She clarified vague promises. She even caught a mistake in one of the presentation slides, a small error in translation that could have caused offense. She corrected it without drawing attention, her calm presence holding the room steady. By the time the 2 hours were over, the investors were smiling, laughing, and shaking Victor's hand. But their final words weren't directed at him. They looked at Mara, and one of them said, warmly in Arabic, "Thanks to you, Miss Omar. We consider him trustworthy." Victor blinked. He had closed the deal, but it wasn't his victory. It was hers. When the room emptied, Victor stayed seated, staring at nothing. His empire had just been saved by the woman who had spent a year wiping down his floors. Mara gathered her notes, the rag from earlier still folded beside them. She turned to leave when Victor finally spoke. "Where did you learn to do that?" She didn't smile. Her voice was calm, almost weary. "Life," she said, in the silence of rooms where no one expects you to speak. Victor had no response. For once, the man who always had a comeback, an insult, a demand, had nothing. But not everyone in that mansion felt awe. From the hallway, Bianca, Victor's sharp, ambitious personal assistant, had been watching. Her arms were crossed, her jaw tight. To her, Mara wasn't a miracle. She was a threat. And in Bianca's world, threats had to be eliminated. The next morning, the mansion was different. The marble floors still gleamed. The walls still carried their expensive art, but something invisible had changed. Whispers followed Mara wherever she walked. Glances lingered longer than before. People who once ignored her now stared, some with admiration, others with quiet resentment. She had become visible, and visibility, she realized, was both a gift and a danger. Bianca confronted her first. "Good morning, Mara," she said sweetly. Too sweet. Mara, calm as ever, replied, "Good morning, Miss Bianca." Bianca's smile tightened. "So, your little performance yesterday made quite the impression." Must feel nice to be special for a day. Mara gave the faintest smile, her voice even. Sometimes one day is all it takes to change everything, especially when it's earned. Bianca's jaw clenched. Her heels clicked against the marble like daggers as she walked away. Mara stood a little taller. Later, Victor summoned Mara to his office. The man behind the desk looked different now. Less polished, more human. His tie was loose, his eyes tired, as though the weight of yesterday was still pressing down on him. I spoke with the investors, he said. They want you at the next meetings. Officially. Mara raised an eyebrow. As what? A translator? Victor hesitated. As the company's international liaison. The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time in her life, Mara was being offered a seat at the table not as a servant, but as a professional. She studied him. Calm. Controlled. And your team? They'll accept this. They'll have to, Victor said. Or they can leave. Mara didn't look away. Do you trust me? Or are you just trying to save your deal? He paused, his confidence faltering. Maybe both, he admitted. But I saw something in you yesterday I can't ignore. Mara nodded slowly. I'll do it, but on one condition. Victor leaned forward. Name it. No more uniform, she said. And I don't enter through the back door. For a long moment, Victor just stared at her. Then, for the first time, a genuine smile touched his face. Deal. And so, Mara Omar walked out of that office, not as the maid of the Reynolds mansion, but as a woman stepping into a new role, into a new life. The marble floors still gleamed. The art still hung. But beneath her feet, the ground felt different now. No longer the floor of someone else's house. It felt like the first stones of her own foundation. But every rise brings shadows. And in another corner of the building, Bianca's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Her eyes burned with resentment. She whispered to herself, let's see how long her little miracle lasts. That was the moment the true war began. Not over language, not over deals, but over the right of one invisible woman to finally be seen. When Mara first walked through the glass doors of Reynolds Innovations in downtown Miami, it felt unreal. No gray uniform, no side entrances, no one waving her away like she was in the wrong place. Instead, she wore a modest suit. Her new badge read, Mara Omar, International Communications Liaison. She walked past security, past polished floors and glass offices, and every step echoed with something she had never felt before. Recognition. But recognition is a double-edged sword. Some faces turned toward her with smiles. Others stared too long, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. Mara was no longer invisible. Invisibility always comes with a cost. The investors were already waiting on the 14th floor. Victor greeted them with his usual sharp formality, but the moment Mara entered the room, everything shifted. The eldest investor, his beard silver at the edges, stood and smiled warmly. Miss Omar, he said in Arabic, a true pleasure to see you again. Mara returned the greeting with grace, her presence softening the room instantly. She didn't just translate that day. She guided. She navigated. She adjusted tone, softened offense, bridged misunderstandings that no spreadsheet or presentation could ever capture. When Victor spoke too directly, she rephrased with respect. When an investor hinted at hesitation, she leaned in with context that turned doubt into agreement. She was no longer a maid holding a cloth. She was a bridge that no one else could build. And Victor, he knew it. Every time her voice filled the air, something shifted in his eyes. Not arrogance, not pity, something closer to humility. But while the meeting blossomed upstairs, a storm brewed below. In the copy room, Bianca sat with narrowed eyes, staring at a stack of papers. She had been with Victor for years. She had fought for his attention, his trust, his approval. And now, in a matter of weeks, Mara had walked in and taken the spotlight. Bianca's pride burned like fire. On her desk lay a printed contract in Arabic, dense, technical, difficult to parse even for experts. And tucked inside it was her weapon, one small clause. Just a few vague words about intellectual property rights. A mistranslation so subtle, it was almost invisible, but powerful enough to shift control of patents from the investors to Reynolds Innovations, something they would never agree to if they realized. Bianca smiled bitterly. "Let's see how smart she really is," she whispered, and slipped the page into the folder for the next meeting. Upstairs, the discussion rolled on smoothly. Victor was confident now, almost enjoying himself. But Mara noticed something. An investor handed her the new draft of the agreement. She skimmed through it quickly, her sharp eyes running over every line. And then, her brow furrowed. Her fingers paused on one sentence. A chill ran through her. She looked up slowly. "Mr. Al-Fahim," she said respectfully in Arabic. "With all due respect, there is a serious error in this clause." The room went silent. Victor leaned forward. "What kind of error?" Mara took a steady breath. This wording would give Reynolds Innovations full ownership of any patents created on foreign soil. That directly contradicts both the English version and the verbal agreement you made. The investors stiffened, their whispers sharp and tense. Victor's face went pale. "You're sure?" Mara nodded firmly. "I'm certain, but if you let me correct it now, I can stop this from becoming a disaster." Victor gave a small nod, trusting her. And Mara did what she always did. She became the bridge. She explained the mistake with honesty, corrected the language with care, and calmed the storm before it could erupt. The investors listened closely. When she finished, the eldest one smiled again and placed his hand gently on the table. "You don't work for him," he said in Arabic, eyes kind. "He works because you are here." Victor let out a low breath, half laughing, half shaken, because he knew it was true. Downstairs, Bianca's phone buzzed. She opened an email, subject to internal review. Report to HR immediately. Her plan had been exposed. Her downfall had begun. That night, Victor called Mara into his office. The man who had once dismissed her as the maid now looked at her differently. His voice was quiet, honest. "You changed this deal," he said. "You changed this company. And you changed me." Mara stood tall, meeting his gaze without fear. "You're just seeing what was always here," she replied softly. Victor was silent for a long time. For a man who had once believed power was measured in money and control, this moment was different, because he realized real power had been scrubbing his floors all along. But Mara also knew the truth. Respect won in one meeting could vanish in the next. For her, every step forward was a battle. Every glance from an ally or enemy carried weight. And every word she spoke was more than translation. It was survival, transformation, and revolution all at once. And so, while the company cheered the success of their new deal, Mara prepared herself. Because she knew something most people in that building didn't. Her greatest challenges were not behind her. They were waiting, just beyond the horizon. The ink on the contract had barely dried when the next call came. A new wave of negotiations, this time not in Miami, but in Abu Dhabi. For Mara, the news felt like both a test and a promise. It meant stepping into a world that was not foreign, but familiar, a world of languages, traditions, and voices she had grown up around. But now, she wasn't arriving as someone's maid. She was arriving as the voice of an entire corporation. When she told her younger sister, Hannah, the girl's eyes lit up with both pride and disbelief. "You? Flying across the world in business class?" Hannah laughed. "You're not the same woman who used to cry at night in that mansion." Mara smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Hannah's face. "No, I'm not. But I need you with me. Not as my shadow, as my anchor." And so, for the first time in years, the sisters boarded a plane together. From the skies above Miami to the glowing desert lights below, the journey was more than miles. It was a crossing from survival to possibility. Abu Dhabi embraced them with heat, gold, and grandeur. The skyline shimmered with towers of glass and steel. The call to prayer floated through the air, weaving tradition into modernity. Mara stood at the balcony of her hotel, Hannah at her side, staring at a city where history and future walked hand in hand. "Do you feel it?" Hannah whispered. "Yes," Mara said, her voice soft but steady. "This isn't just their land. In a way, it feels like coming home." The meetings were grueling, but Mara's presence transformed them. Day after day, she sat across from dignitaries, investors, and executives, her voice carrying calm authority. She listened before she spoke. She translated not only words, but intent, nuance, and respect. When tempers rose, her voice soothed. When pride clashed with pride, her tone found common ground. Soon, the investors began to request her presence before Victor's. And for the first time, Victor didn't argue. Instead, he watched. From across the table, from late-night calls, from the quiet moments between flights. He watched Mara not as an employee, not even as a savior, but as someone who carried something he had never been able to buy. Integrity. But distance has a strange way of shaping hearts. Though Mara was thousands of miles away, Victor called often. At first, it was business, updates, strategies, new proposals. But slowly, the conversations shifted. He began asking how her day was, what she saw from her hotel window, what stories her grandmother used to tell. And Mara, cautious but honest, found herself answering. One night, after a particularly exhausting round of negotiations, Victor's voice softened. You know, Mara, when you're not in the room, I can feel it. The company feels it. I feel it. She stayed silent for a moment, staring at the desert stars. Then she replied, Then don't lean on me like a crutch, Victor. Stand on your own. Be the man you want to be, even when I'm not there. The line was quiet for a long time, and then he whispered, You make me want to be better. Mara closed her eyes, holding the phone close. Then do it. Not for me, Victor. For the man you haven't met yet. The one you're still becoming. Her work in Abu Dhabi was not just about deals. One evening, at a private dinner, the investors presented her with a small gift. A pendant of silver and onyx, engraved with Arabic words that read, Wisdom and courage. She accepted it humbly, her eyes glistening. To her, it was more than jewelry. It was a reminder that even in places far from home, her voice was no longer ignored. It was honored. Meanwhile, Hannah thrived in the new environment too. She attended cultural events, met students her age, and began dreaming again. Dreams she had buried during the years of hardship in Miami. One evening, as the sisters sat by the corniche, Hannah looked at Mara with tears in her eyes. Do you realize what you've done? You didn't just change your life. You gave me mine back. Mara wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. We've both carried silence for too long, she whispered. Now it's time to speak. Both of us. By the end of those 3 months, Mara had become more than a liaison. She was a strategist, a trusted partner, a voice that executives leaned on as much as they leaned on Victor himself. But more than that, she had become something she had almost forgotten she could be, whole. And when she finally boarded the plane back to Miami, pendant against her chest, sister at her side, and Victor waiting on the other end of the line, she knew the story of her life was no longer one of invisibility. It was one of transformation. But transformation always calls for a reckoning, because the higher you rise, the more the world demands you to prove you belong. The plane touched down in Miami, but the city no longer felt the same. For years, Miami had been a place where Mara was invisible, sweeping floors, wiping tables, walking through back doors. But now, when she returned, she carried something she hadn't before. Not wealth, not power, something deeper. Dignity. Back at the headquarters of Victor Hale's empire, whispers filled the corridors. Some said she was just lucky. Some said she was dangerous. Others said she was the future. But Mara didn't let their voices steer her. She had already learned, when the world doesn't know your worth, you don't ask for permission. You show them. The partnership with the Gulf investors blossomed. New research centers were built. New projects took flight. And through it all, Mara was at the center, not as a shadow, but as a leader. It was no longer Hale Industries. It became Hale and Omar International. For the first time, Mara's name was not hidden in a file or forgotten in a hallway. It was on the building itself, etched into the glass and steel. But Mara's greatest triumph wasn't the empire she helped build. It was what she created with it. On the grounds of the old mansion, once a place of silence and invisibility, stood a new foundation. A leadership institute for young immigrant girls, for those the world had overlooked, for the dreamers who carried voices no one wanted to hear. In the garden, Children laughed and learned. They wrote in notebooks, practiced speeches, and shared stories of who they wanted to become. Mara walked among them quietly, her pendant catching the sunlight, her steps steady. Every smile, every question, every dream she witnessed reminded her why she had fought to be seen. One afternoon, Victor joined her in the garden. He was no longer the sharp, ruthless CEO she once knew. He had softened, not in strength, but in spirit. "Do you ever think back?" he asked, watching the children play. "To the first day, I noticed you, the rag in your hand." Mara smiled faintly. "I wasn't just carrying a rag, Victor. I was carrying my whole life, and I was waiting for the moment to set it down." He nodded, eyes heavy with a respect that went beyond words. "And you did more than that. You carried me out of myself." She looked at him quietly, then turned her gaze back to the girls. "No, Victor, I didn't carry you. You finally chose to walk." But the most powerful moment came when a little girl tugged at Mara's sleeve. Her eyes were wide, hopeful, trembling with courage. "Miss Omar, I wrote something. Can you read it first? I want to know if it's good." Mara knelt down, taking the small notebook into her hands. She met the child's eyes with warmth. "Of course, sweetheart. Show me everything. The world needs your voice." And in that instant, Mara understood. She was no longer just translating words. She was translating futures. The world hadn't given Mara her place. She had built it, word by word, step by step, choice by choice. And in doing so, she had rearranged the walls around her, proving that when someone who is never invited walks into the room and stays, the world has no choice but to shift. And so, the maid who was once invisible became the architect of a legacy that spoke for generations. Not a story of luck, not a story of pity, but a story of power, earned through courage, silence broken, and the fire of a voice finally set free. If this story moved you, remember, your voice matters too. Don't let anyone make you invisible. Subscribe for more powerful stories that prove ordinary people can spark extraordinary change.